Whether it be the 2017-2018 Golden State Warriors or the 95-96 Chicago Bulls, one thing is going to remain true for all of these rosters, regardless of how good of a team the GM put together. There's always going to be a chink in the armor. For the 2017-2018 Warriors, that was their lack of a true big man, considering they were running Draymond Green out at center. For the 95-96 Bulls, if you let Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant tell it, every person on this roster hated Michael Jordan's guts. They need some help, man. What is even... But that's a topic for another video another day. What we're going to be breaking down today is the biggest weaknesses of all of the true NBA contenders this season. And what I'm calling a true contender is a team that I would not be surprised at all to see them in the NBA Finals competing for a Larry O.B. And I broke this down to 6 teams. So without further ado, let's get right into our first team, the Boston Celtics. Now, it's honestly really hard to find a weakness in a team that's just been absolutely running through the Eastern Conference. As well as that, they have an amazing record against all of the top teams out west that I would consider true contenders. But for me, their biggest weakness definitely just has to be their reliance on the three-point shot. As of right now, they lead the NBA in 3 points attempted, and they have a hefty shot diet coming from out there, with 47% of their total shot attempts coming from beyond the arc. And when you pair that with them being bottom 3 at shots in the rim in the entire league, that can be a really risky combination going into the playoffs. As we all know, you have to get the easy ones, and you can't just rely on your three-point shot falling off all the time. Now, with that being said, they currently do have 5 players attempting at least 5 threes per game and shooting 35% from beyond the arc, and that's just not very sustainable to me. You can't expect all of these guys to keep up that kind of efficiency on that kind of volume going into the playoffs, especially when you're going to be going 7 games against the same team that's going to be scheming against you every single night, figuring out how to get those guys out of their spots, etc., etc. As well as that, I was speaking with one of my buddies that's the biggest Boston Celtics fan I know. He probably doesn't miss a Celtics game. I can't say the same myself. I mean, as you know, I'm a huge Thunder fan, and I usually keep most of my attention towards the Western Conference. But they are an extremely complacent fourth quarter team. They'll go into the fourth with a massive lead, and it just kind of seems like they lose motivation going into that fourth quarter because they think that they have the game in the bag. And there's been a lot of comebacks on the Boston Celtics this year in the fourth quarter. And while they've been able to close those games out just because they're extremely talented, again, I don't think that's going to be sustainable in the 7-game series, and you really need to get teams out of there as fast as you can, and you can't let off pressure in the fourth quarter, especially when you're going against the other best 7 teams in the Eastern Conference. Now, even with that being said, the Celtics are still going to be my favorite to come out of the Eastern Conference. I'm just hoping that come playoff time, they can get a little bit more physical, chippy in the paint, and utilize the personnel that they have to get there a lot more. You, of course, have Drew Holiday, you have the Jays, who can both get to the rim at will, and you have Kristaps Porzingis, who has been extremely efficient on post touches this year. I'm just hoping, again, that they utilize that a little bit more come playoff time. The only team that I can see realistically knocking them out of this year's playoffs in the Eastern Conference is going to be the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, the biggest weakness for this Milwaukee Bucks team is definitely just going to be the health of Giannis. He's been rehabbing this Achilles injury for the past few weeks now. He came out a couple of nights ago and was trying to warm up on it, and it was just really apparent that he was still in a lot of discomfort. Now, you don't want to rush him back from this injury because we've seen guys try and come back from injuries prematurely for the playoffs before. 1, they're just not themselves, and 2, there's a really high chance of re-aggravating that injury and making it even worse. And Giannis being a 6'11 guy that relies heavily on his athleticism, an Achilles tear could be disastrous for him. This Bucks team without Giannis is a first or second round exit. I know that you have Damian Lillard leading the ship out there, but what happened to all of the Damian Lillard teams that he was leading? First or second round exit. I know that he had a conference finals appearance, but he's older now, and this team just lacks depth. That's another big thing for me, is that this team is just extremely top heavy. A lot of that has to do with Chris Middleton, as I feel like he was supposed to be the solidified third option for them. I know that he's been dealing with this injury and he was on a minute restriction to start the year, but they need him to be that solidified third guy if they want to compete in this year's playoffs. Now, the team we're going to be talking about next is going to be the Minnesota Timberwolves, and their biggest weakness by far is this lack of offensive firepower. As it sits right now, they're currently the 18th offensive rating in the entire league, so almost bottom third, and that is going to be a problem going into the playoffs. Don't get me wrong, I know that the defense is fantastic, but when you have so many offensive-oriented teams out west, you're going to have to keep up scoring no matter how good the defense is, and I feel like there's some defenses out west that could possibly just bring this already kind of slow, stagnant offense that the Minnesota Timberwolves have to a screeching halt. A big reason why I feel like they're just not as dangerous offensively as some of these other teams out west are is just the lack of a secondary elite ball handler. Now, I'm not saying secondary option because we all know that Karl-Anthony Towns is the second option on that team, but secondary ball handler, that's going to be Mike Conley. We of course know that Ant-Man's going to do what he does. He's that guy out there in Minnesota. But when your secondary guy that's running your offense for you is Mike Conley, and do not get me wrong, this is no disrespect to Mike Conley. He's a great veteran point guard, but he's just not what some of these secondary guys in the West are. You got to think of guys like Jamal Murray, Paul George, Jalen Williams. What do all of these guys have in common? They are all-star caliber players that are the secondary ball handlers on their team. And these are all teams that you could potentially see in these playoffs. Like I had mentioned at the top of the video, I would not be surprised to see these guys in the finals at all, but they definitely do need to step the offense up a ton for them to be legitimately scary contenders. Up next on today's list, we're going to have the Oklahoma City Thunder, who their biggest weakness is just by far lack of playoff experience. The average age of this roster is like 23 and a half years old. For us to be the second seed right now, insane. By far the most successful young team by average age probably ever. We have our second and third best players on the team in Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren, who have never even touched a playoff floor before. Two veterans in Mike Muscala and Gordon Hayward. Mike Muscala gets pretty much no PT on this team. And then you have Gordon Hayward, who has been really good for us, and he of course had his runs with the Utah Jazz where they made the playoffs a few times, but he's not like any playoff savant or anything. So I'm just really hoping that this doesn't come back to bite us in our ass. Because regardless of how good your team is, if you've never been there before, sometimes the lights can just be too bright. And having a team scheme against you for 4 to 7 games in a row, it's way different than just running through teams in the regular season. And none of these guys have ever experienced that before. As well as a lack of experience, we also lack rebounding. And don't get me wrong, Chet has been great this year. He's pulling around 7 to 8 rebounds a game, but we are consistently out-rebounded. Now, we do have a really good defense, but you can play 24 seconds of lock-up defense. If they grab that offensive board and get an easy putback, all of that was for nothing. So I'm just really hoping that that's a hole that we can fill this next offseason, but our team right now, we just can't corral rebounds, and that scares me a lot going into this year's playoffs. Up next, we're going to have the Denver Nuggets, and I'll keep this one kind of short and sweet just like I did the Boston Celtics, simply just because they've been dominant this year. I know that they sit at the 3rd seed right now, but that's simply because I feel like they've been coasting, and to have that luxury of being able to coast while in this stacked Western Conference and still have the 3rd seed is kind of scary if you think about it. But the biggest weakness for me with this roster going into this year's playoffs is simply that they didn't change anything on this roster. If anything, they lost some key contributors in Jeff Green and Bruce Brown. And it seems like every other Western Conference team that is genuinely competing for the championship got significantly better in some aspect. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that you're not going to want to shake up this championship core that went all the way this last year, but just adding a little bit of variety to this offense I feel would have helped them tremendously, because they're probably going to run into some of the same teams that they faced this last year in the playoffs, and they already know how to scheme against this team while they themselves got better. So that can be a little bit scary if you're a Nuggets fan, but like I mentioned before, they're still the favorites to come out of the Western Conference right now, so you don't got to be too worried, but maybe just a little bit. And last but definitely not least, we're going to have the Los Angeles Clippers. And the biggest weakness for them going into this year's playoffs is undoubtedly just going to be the health. And I feel like I sound like a broken record here, because basically since Kawhi Leonard and Paul George have linked up in LA, there's been consistent health issues where just one of them can't stay on the court. as of right now, you have Paul George down with an injury. Russell Westbrook fractured his hand. They're hoping that he can be back before the start of the playoffs. And if they're missing him going into the playoffs, they're going to be missing that spark plug off of the bench. Problems. If they're missing Paul George going into the playoffs, their secondary scorer. Problems. And I know that you're still going to have Kawhi Leonard and James Harden, and that duo by themselves can win you a playoff series. But winning a playoff series and making it all the way to the Larry O'B are two completely different things. So I'm just hoping, for the sake of the Clippers, that they can have a completely healthy roster going into the playoffs. Because I don't know about you guys, but I'm just kind of sick of the what ifs. We know who Paul George is. We know who Kawhi Leonard is. They brought in James Harden and Russell Westbrook, who have complemented them amazingly. I just want this team to be at their full power. Because if they are, it's going to be extremely difficult to get this team out in 7 games. And they're the only team that I can see legitimately competing with the Denver Nuggets in a full 7-game series. Like I mentioned, I have the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Minnesota Timberwolves on here. I feel like if the Timberwolves meet up with the Nuggets, they're getting outscored. If the Nuggets meet up with the Thunder, they're champions. The Thunder is a 23-and-a-half-year-old average age roster. So I kind of feel like I know how those would go. But with the Los Angeles Clippers, they have the firepower, they have the defense, they have the playoff experience to really make that series a challenging one. So again, for their sake, I'm really hoping they're 100% healthy going into this year. And that is going to do it for me, y'all. I just want to say thank you so much for watching today's video if you made it this far. And if you did and you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to like and subscribe. We just recently hit our first milestone of 100 subscribers, so we're officially on the road to 500 subs. Again, thank you guys so much for that. All of that is because of you, and I could not be more grateful. One more time, hashtag AskOTB. This is something for me to connect to you guys on a little bit more personal level. All that you have to do is drop a hashtag AskOTB in the comment section down below with any sort of NBA question, hot take, anything like that for a chance to be featured in one of these videos. I'll be going through the best ones for a couple minutes at the end of each video, so if you're interested in that, again, hashtag AskOTB. Again, thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I'm getting out of here. Peace.